On a quiet suburban street in Texas, what began as an ordinary weekend turned into one of the most disturbing family tragedies local investigators have encountered in recent years. A 34-year-old man is now facing charges of first-degree murder after authorities say he killed his 28-year-old wife upon discovering her affair with the most unlikely person imaginable, his own father. The shocking betrayal and subsequent violent act have left a community stunned and investigators piecing together the precise sequence of events that culminated in the death. The case, documented in detail by police affidavits, neighbors' observations, and forensic evidence, began with the gradual unraveling of a marriage. For several months, tension had grown between the husband and his wife. Friends described their relationship as strained, marked by increasing distance and unexplained absences. What the husband did not know at the time was that those absences were connected to clandestine encounters between his wife and his 62-year-old father, a retired military veteran living only a few miles away. According to investigators, the affair developed quietly, hidden behind layers of secrecy. Phone records later recovered from the wife's device revealed a steady pattern of late-night text messages, explicit photographs, and repeated calls between her and her father-in-law. The content of those communications left little doubt as to the nature of the relationship. Detectives believe the affair had been ongoing for nearly 6 months before discovery, during which the two coordinated meetings in hotels, in the father's residence, and disturbingly, sometimes within the couple's own home when the husband was away on night shifts. The unraveling began on the evening of July 12. The husband returned home earlier than expected from work, citing illness. Upon entering the house, he found his wife in the living room, seemingly startled by his arrival. At first, nothing appeared out of place. But when he went to retrieve his phone charger from the bedroom, he noticed his wife's phone buzzing repeatedly on the nightstand. The name displayed on the screen was his father's. Suspicion gripped him immediately. He unlocked the phone using the couple's shared passcode and scrolled through the most recent messages. The evidence of betrayal was unmistakable. Graphic texts, intimate declarations, and explicit photos exchanged with his father. The discovery triggered what prosecutors describe as an immediate emotional collapse. Witnesses later reported that the husband appeared visibly shaken when he stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, pacing back and forth for nearly 20 minutes before re-entering the house. According to the timeline established by investigators, he confronted his wife in the kitchen, demanding explanations. While the exact words exchanged will never be known, physical evidence indicates that the confrontation escalated quickly. Neighbors told police they heard raised voices, objects breaking, and heavy footsteps inside the home around 8:45 p.m. Several described the sounds as consistent with a violent struggle. Forensic technicians later found overturned chairs, shattered glass, and spilled liquids across the kitchen floor, supporting the accounts of a heated altercation. What began as a verbal confrontation appears to have transformed into a physical clash within minutes. Investigators believe the critical moment occurred when the husband cornered his wife near the sink area. Bruising patterns on the victim's arms indicate she tried to resist being restrained. Autopsy results later confirmed that manual strangulation was the cause of death. Ligature marks were absent, pointing to direct compression of the airway by the suspect's hands. The medical examiner estimated that the act required sustained force for at least 4 minutes, underscoring the intensity of the moment. Timeline reconstruction shows that the wife lost consciousness between 8:50 and 8:55 p.m. The husband continued applying pressure until she was no longer breathing. Once the act was complete, he released her body, which fell against the tiled kitchen floor. Blood from a minor head injury formed a small pool near the refrigerator. By the time paramedics arrived later that night, the victim had no pulse and showed clear signs of prolonged asphyxiation. Immediately after the killing, the husband appeared disoriented. Police reports indicate that instead of calling 911, he sat in the living room for nearly 15 minutes, staring at his wife's unlocked phone. Officers believe he reviewed the incriminating messages multiple times before finally grabbing his car keys and leaving the house. Surveillance cameras from nearby residences captured his vehicle pulling out of the driveway at approximately 9:12 p.m. The gruesome discovery was made hours later. A concerned neighbor, having heard the commotion and then noticing an unusual silence, decided to check on the house around 11:30 p.m. Through the front window, she saw broken glass and lights still on inside. Alarmed, she contacted local authorities. Responding officers forced entry and found the victim lying motionless in the kitchen. Emergency responders pronounced her dead at the scene. Meanwhile, the husband was already on the run. He drove northbound along the interstate, covering more than 100 miles before his vehicle was detected by Highway Patrol near the Oklahoma border. At approximately 2:40 a.m., state troopers initiated a traffic stop after identifying the vehicle from the BOLO, "Be on the lookout" alert. The suspect surrendered without resistance. Officers noted that he appeared emotionally detached, his clothing still showing traces of blood consistent with the crime scene. Back at the couple's residence, crime scene technicians worked throughout the night. Photographs, fingerprints, and DNA samples were collected. The wife's phone was seized as primary evidence, containing the messages that prosecutors later described as the central trigger for the killing. Investigators also obtained the father's phone through a search warrant. Records confirmed the intimate nature of the affair, further corroborating the motive. Detectives pieced together the sequence with remarkable precision. The betrayal of a spouse is not uncommon in homicide cases, but the involvement of a close family member elevated this incident into an extraordinary category of domestic crime. Experts in criminal psychology consulted by local media emphasized the intensity of emotional trauma that such a discovery could provoke. To be betrayed simultaneously by a partner and a parent creates a psychological rupture that, in this case, erupted into lethal violence. Prosecutors argue that the killing was not merely a crime of passion but an intentional act. The duration of strangulation, the decision not to call emergency services, and the subsequent flight all point to awareness of the consequences. They contend that while the discovery of the affair was shocking, the choice to take a life was deliberate. The district attorney's office has charged the suspect with murder in the first degree, rejecting any possibility of reducing the charge to manslaughter. This first part of the case file establishes the background and immediate circumstances of the killing. The betrayal, the discovery, the confrontation, the act itself, and the flight from the scene are now firmly documented in court records. Every detail underscores the devastating convergence of infidelity, family betrayal, and uncontrolled rage that turned a suburban home into a homicide scene. At the heart of the tragedy lies a victim whose decision set a chain of events in motion and a suspect whose inability to process betrayal resulted in irreversible violence. The involvement of the suspect's father adds a layer of complexity that continues to draw national attention, highlighting not only the disturbing nature of the affair but also the extreme consequences of secrets kept within families. The fatal night of July 12 has now been reconstructed with forensic precision, leaving little ambiguity about what occurred inside the modest Texas home. From the moment the husband discovered the messages on his wife's phone to the final minutes when he squeezed the life out of her, the events unfolded rapidly, brutally, and with irreversible consequences. The aftermath of the killing set into motion one of the most complex domestic homicide investigations seen in Texas in recent years. By dawn on July 13, law enforcement agencies across multiple jurisdictions had been mobilized, piecing together the evidence from a crime scene that was both intimate and explosive. The crime was not just a matter of marital betrayal, it was a case layered with psychological trauma, family dysfunction, and legal complexities that challenged investigators and prosecutors alike. When officers arrived at the residence shortly after midnight, they found the victim lying unresponsive in the kitchen. The room was a scene of chaos, broken glass scattered across the floor, chairs overturned, and blood traces near the refrigerator. The victim showed obvious signs of strangulation, bruising around the neck, petechiae in the eyes, and defensive wounds on her forearms. Paramedics confirmed that she had been dead for several hours. The husband was absent, his car missing from the driveway. Neighbors provided statements about loud arguments earlier that night, strengthening suspicions of domestic violence turned fatal. The discovery of the victim's phone on the counter quickly shifted the case from a routine homicide investigation into a scandal of extraordinary proportions. Texts and images revealed an affair between the victim and her father-in-law, setting the stage for both motive and public shock. A BOLO alert was issued for the husband's vehicle at approximately 12:30 a.m. The alert described him as dangerous, emotionally unstable, and likely armed, though no weapons were found at the crime scene. Highway patrol units spread across major interstates leading out of Texas. Surveillance footage from local gas stations and traffic cameras later helped map the suspect's route north toward Oklahoma. At 2:40 a.m., state troopers near the border spotted a vehicle matching the description. Dashcam footage later released showed the car drifting slightly within its lane, suggesting fatigue or disorientation. The stop was conducted without resistance. Officers found the suspect alone, wearing the same clothing described by neighbors earlier that evening. Blood traces were visible on his shirt and under his fingernails. He was taken into custody and transported to a local detention facility. Back at the residence, forensic teams worked methodically through the night. Every item in the kitchen was photographed and catalogued. Fingerprints on shattered glass were matched to both the victim and the suspect, corroborating accounts of a struggle. DNA samples were collected from under the victim's fingernails, consistent with defensive actions during strangulation. The victim's phone became the central piece of evidence. Digital forensic experts extracted over 3,000 messages exchanged between her and her father-in-law over a 6-month period. Many of the communications contained explicit content, leaving little doubt about the physical nature of their relationship. Investigators confirmed that several of their meetings had taken place in nearby motels, supported by receipts and surveillance footage. The father-in-law was brought in for questioning later that day. He initially denied any improper relationship, but confronted with the evidence, he admitted to the affair. However, authorities determined that his involvement was limited to the relationship itself and not the homicide. While morally scandalous, his actions did not constitute a chargeable offense under state law unless coercion or abuse of authority could be proven. For the purposes of the homicide investigation, he was classified as a witness and potential corroborating source. The medical examiner's office released preliminary findings on July 14. The cause of death was listed as asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. The report detailed fractured cartilage in the victim's neck, bruising consistent with strong grip pressure, and defensive wounds on her arms and hands. Toxicology results indicated no presence of alcohol or drugs in her system, eliminating impairment as a factor. The report established a clear timeline. The victim's death occurred between 8:50 and 9 p.m., shortly after the argument began. The sustained pressure required to cause fatal strangulation underscored the deliberate nature of the act. Prosecutors cited this as evidence supporting a charge of premeditated murder rather than manslaughter in the heat of passion. News of the case spread rapidly across national outlets. The shocking elements: a wife's affair with her father-in-law, a husband's violent reaction, and the destruction of an entire family, dominated headlines. Social media platforms erupted with commentary, with many expressing sympathy for the husband's sense of betrayal while condemning the act of murder. Others criticized the father-in-law, labeling his involvement as the most disturbing aspect of the case. Local residents of the Texas suburb where the crime occurred described the family as previously quiet and unremarkable. Neighbors reported occasional arguments but nothing suggesting the potential for homicide. The revelation of the affair stunned the community, transforming the family's home into a site of morbid curiosity. Experts in criminology highlighted the case as an example of how intimate betrayal can escalate into lethal violence. Studies of domestic homicide frequently cite infidelity as a leading trigger, but the involvement of a close family member added an unusual psychological dimension. Commentators suggested that the case could prompt renewed discussion about mental health interventions and conflict resolution in domestic disputes. At the same time, the case raised uncomfortable questions about morality and boundaries within families. The father-in-law's role, while not criminally prosecutable, was widely condemned as unethical and destructive. Psychologists noted that such relationships carry the potential to destabilize entire family structures, often with catastrophic consequences. As the trial date approached, investigators continued compiling evidence. Digital records were cross-referenced with motel surveillance footage, credit card receipts, and witness statements. Forensic analysis of the husband's clothing confirmed the presence of the victim's blood and skin cells, reinforcing the physical evidence of the struggle. The father-in-law remained under scrutiny, though no additional charges were filed. Authorities indicated that while his behavior was morally reprehensible, the absence of coercion or abuse of authority placed it outside the scope of criminal law. His testimony, however, was expected to play a central role in court proceedings, particularly in establishing the timeline of the affair. The investigation transformed a private tragedy into a public spectacle, exposing layers of betrayal, violence, and legal complexity. From the moment of discovery to the forensic evidence and eventual arrest, every step of the case underscored the devastating consequences of secrecy and infidelity. The victim lay at the center of a narrative that shattered multiple lives, while the suspect faced the full weight of the justice system. As Part 2 concludes, the framework of the case is firmly established. A husband betrayed by his wife and father, a violent response that ended in death, and an investigation that brought every detail into public view. The trial ahead promised to explore not only the legal dimensions of the killing but also the deeper moral questions that the case forced into the national conversation. The trial of the Texas man accused of killing his wife after discovering her affair with his father opened under intense national attention. By the time jury selection began, the case had already been covered extensively across television networks, newspapers, and digital platforms. Reporters filled the courtroom benches each day, and legal commentators described the proceedings as a collision of betrayal, rage, and morality unlike anything seen in recent memory. The prosecution moved quickly to establish its framework. In opening statements, they portrayed the defendant as a man who, while betrayed, nonetheless made the deliberate choice to end his wife's life. They emphasized that emotional shock did not justify strangulation carried out over several minutes, nor did it excuse leaving the victim without medical aid. Prosecutors argued that his subsequent attempt to flee demonstrated a clear awareness of guilt. The defense countered by framing the killing as an impulsive act driven by overwhelming emotional collapse. They highlighted the extraordinary nature of the betrayal, not just marital infidelity but infidelity with a father, a betrayal that struck at both the institution of marriage and the integrity of family. Defense attorneys argued that the psychological trauma created an environment of diminished capacity, pushing their client beyond rational judgment. The prosecution built its case meticulously. Digital evidence played a central role. Investigators presented thousands of text messages exchanged between the victim and the defendant's father, many of them explicit. These records established both motive and timeline. Surveillance footage and motel receipts corroborated the physical nature of the affair. For the jury, the evidence painted a vivid picture of months of deception leading to the fatal confrontation. Forensic testimony followed. The medical examiner described in clinical detail the injuries sustained by the victim: fractured cartilage in the neck, bruising consistent with sustained grip, and defensive wounds on her forearms. The autopsy findings left no doubt that manual strangulation was the cause of death and that it required deliberate force maintained over several minutes. Prosecutors emphasized this point repeatedly, arguing that the length of time involved eliminated any possibility of a purely impulsive act. Crime scene photographs were displayed, showing the overturned chairs, broken glass, and blood near the refrigerator. While graphic, the images were intended to drive home the violence of the encounter. Forensic analysts further testified that DNA under the victim's fingernails matched the defendant, confirming a struggle. Several neighbors were called to testify about the events of July 12. They described hearing loud arguments, shouting, and the sound of objects breaking. One neighbor recounted hearing a sudden silence following the noise, consistent with the time the victim lost consciousness. Their testimony supported the prosecution's timeline and reinforced the narrative of a violent confrontation escalating to homicide. The most anticipated testimony came from the defendant's father, whose involvement in the affair lay at the heart of the case. Called by the prosecution, he admitted under oath to the 6-month relationship with his daughter-in-law. He described the affair as consensual and acknowledged meeting her regularly at motels and occasionally at his own home. His demeanor in court was widely described as detached, even clinical, as he recounted the details. While the prosecution used his testimony to confirm the motive, the defense seized the opportunity to highlight the father's role in creating the psychological conditions that triggered the killing. Defense attorneys pressed him on his betrayal of his son, his disregard for family boundaries, and the reckless nature of his actions. Legal analysts later noted that while the father was not criminally liable, his testimony served as one of the most morally damning elements of the entire trial. The defense built its argument around the concept of extreme emotional disturbance. Expert witnesses in psychology were brought in to explain the potential mental impact of discovering not only spousal infidelity but infidelity involving a parent. They argued that such a revelation could shatter one's sense of identity and control, leading to impulsive violence. The defense sought to convince jurors that while the killing was tragic, it was not premeditated but instead the result of an uncontrollable emotional collapse. They also highlighted the lack of planning. No weapon was used, and the incident occurred spontaneously upon the discovery of the messages. The defense suggested that if the killing had been premeditated, the defendant would have armed himself or taken other steps in advance. By emphasizing spontaneity, they aimed to reduce the charge from first-degree murder to second-degree murder or even manslaughter. The prosecution countered these arguments by underscoring the deliberate nature of strangulation. They reminded jurors that it required continuous application of force for several minutes, during which the defendant had ample opportunity to stop. They further argued that the defendant's decision to leave the scene without seeking help was not consistent with an impulsive act of temporary loss of control but with a conscious choice to allow his wife to die. Prosecutors also pointed to his flight northward as evidence of guilt. Instead of contacting authorities, the defendant attempted to cross state lines, behavior prosecutors described as that of a man fully aware of his crime. They closed their case by urging the jury to hold him accountable for a conscious decision to end a life, regardless of the personal betrayal involved. Throughout the trial, jurors listened intently, often taking notes. Observers noted visible discomfort during the presentation of graphic evidence and during the father's testimony. The moral dimensions of the case weighed heavily in the courtroom, as jurors were asked to separate the understandable shock of betrayal from the legality of murder. Legal experts interviewed outside the courtroom suggested that the defense faced an uphill battle. While emotional disturbance could explain the motive, it rarely absolved responsibility when the act itself demonstrated clear deliberation. The prosecution's evidence, particularly the autopsy findings, provided a strong foundation for a conviction of first-degree murder. The trial drew constant media coverage. Headlines across the country highlighted the shocking affair and the subsequent killing. Talk shows debated the psychological impact of betrayal, while online forums buzzed with speculation about the jury's decision. Public opinion was divided. Some sympathized with the defendant, arguing that the betrayal by both spouse and father created unimaginable psychological pain. Others insisted that personal pain could never justify homicide. The father's role drew particularly harsh condemnation. Many commentators described his testimony as cold and self-serving, and public outrage focused as much on his actions as on the killing itself. While he faced no legal consequences, his reputation was irreparably damaged. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides delivered powerful closing arguments. The prosecution reiterated that betrayal, however devastating, could not excuse deliberate murder. They urged jurors to focus on the facts: the sustained strangulation, the failure to seek help, and the attempted escape. The defense, in contrast, pleaded for jurors to consider the human side of the tragedy. They asked the jury to recognize the extraordinary psychological rupture caused by the affair and to see the defendant not as a cold-blooded killer but as a man broken by betrayal. The jury retired to deliberate after weeks of testimony and evidence. Observers described the atmosphere as tense, with the community awaiting a verdict that would determine not only the defendant's fate but also how society viewed the intersection of betrayal and responsibility. The legal question was stark. Did the defendant act with premeditated intent, or was this the tragic but impulsive outcome of unimaginable emotional pain? Part 3 of the case centered on the courtroom battle, where every detail of betrayal and violence was dissected before a jury. The prosecution pressed its case for premeditated murder, while the defense fought to reframe the act as an uncontrollable reaction to extraordinary circumstances. At the heart of the trial lay a family destroyed from within. A wife who chose deception, a father who violated boundaries, and a husband whose response turned fatal. The jurors now carried the weight of deciding justice, with the nation watching closely. The verdict would not only determine the defendant's future but also set a precedent for how the law interprets acts of violence born from betrayal of the deepest kind. The trial that had captivated the nation for weeks reached its conclusion as the jury returned to the courtroom after more than 2 days of deliberations. Anticipation filled the chamber, with reporters lining the benches, legal analysts awaiting judgment, and members of the community watching with rapt attention. For the family at the center of the case, the moment marked the final chapter of a tragedy that had dismantled their lives. The jury delivered its decision with solemn clarity. The defendant was found guilty of murder in the first degree. The verdict confirmed the prosecution's argument that the killing was not merely an impulsive reaction but a deliberate act. Jurors later explained that the evidence of sustained strangulation, the failure to call for medical assistance, and the attempted flight weighed heavily in their determination. The defense's arguments regarding diminished capacity were acknowledged but ultimately rejected. While jurors expressed understanding of the emotional devastation caused by the betrayal, they concluded that it did not excuse the conscious decision to end a life. In interviews after the trial, legal experts noted that the verdict aligned with established precedent. Emotional trauma may explain motive but cannot negate accountability for deliberate homicide. Following the guilty verdict, the court entered the sentencing phase. Prosecutors sought a life sentence without the possibility of parole, citing the severity of the crime and the need for accountability. While the death penalty remained an option under Texas law, the state ultimately chose not to pursue it, citing the absence of aggravating factors such as multiple victims or premeditated planning over time. During sentencing hearings, impact statements were presented. Members of the victim's family described the devastation left by her death, the pain of betrayal, and the enduring loss of a daughter and sister. The defendant's relatives, torn between grief for the victim and loyalty to the accused, pleaded for mercy. They emphasized his previously clean record, his history of steady employment, and his role as a father. The presiding judge addressed the courtroom with measured gravity. In his remarks, he acknowledged the extraordinary circumstances of the case but affirmed that the justice system could not allow betrayal, however painful, to justify murder. He handed down a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 40 years, effectively ensuring that the defendant would spend the majority of his life behind bars. The sentencing drew mixed reactions. Some observers felt the punishment was appropriate, reflecting both accountability and recognition of the unusual psychological factors. Others argued that the sentence was too lenient, considering the brutality of the act, while still others believed it was too harsh, given the emotional collapse that had preceded the killing. Public commentary focused particularly on the moral dimension. Many condemned the father's role, viewing him as the catalyst of the tragedy. Although he faced no legal charges, his reputation was destroyed. Former colleagues and neighbors distanced themselves, and his name became synonymous with betrayal. Analysts suggested that his actions, while not criminal, had set in motion the chain of events that culminated in homicide. The family unit was permanently shattered. The victim was buried in a private service, attended by relatives under heavy media scrutiny. The defendant, now incarcerated, was absent from the funeral, his only communication limited to letters delivered through his attorneys. The father, ostracized by both sides of the family, lived in near isolation, avoiding public appearances and declining interviews. The tragedy extended to the broader community. Neighbors described the home where the killing occurred as forever marked by the crime. Some expressed discomfort walking past it, while others noted that it served as a grim reminder of how hidden conflicts can erupt into violence. The house was eventually sold, but its history lingered in local memory. Legal scholars and psychologists analyzed the case for months afterward. It was cited in academic discussions as an example of how infidelity, particularly when compounded by familial betrayal, can trigger extreme psychological responses. Experts emphasized the importance of mental health interventions in preventing domestic violence, arguing that earlier counseling or mediation might have averted the fatal outcome. Media coverage highlighted the case as part of a broader conversation about morality, family boundaries, and accountability. Talk shows and editorials debated whether the justice system should give greater consideration to emotional trauma in sentencing. While opinions varied, consensus emerged that betrayal could never serve as legal justification for homicide. Inside prison, the defendant began serving his life sentence under close supervision. Reports from correctional staff described him as quiet and compliant, avoiding altercations and participating in limited work assignments. Psychological evaluations noted signs of depression and regret but no indications of ongoing violent tendencies. His attorneys announced plans to appeal the conviction, though legal analysts predicted little chance of success given the weight of evidence. For the defendant, the reality of life imprisonment marked a stark contrast to his previous existence. Once employed in a stable job, living in a suburban home and raising a family, he now faced decades of confinement, his only hope of release tied to parole eligibility in middle age. The father remained a central figure in the narrative despite avoiding legal consequences. Media scrutiny followed him relentlessly, portraying him as the hidden architect of the tragedy. Public outrage forced him into seclusion, and he resigned from community organizations where he had once been active. Interviews with acquaintances described him as deeply isolated, haunted by guilt yet unwilling to speak publicly. His testimony during the trial remained a point of controversy. Some criticized his willingness to detail the affair in court, viewing it as further betrayal of his son. Others argued that his candor was necessary for justice. Either way, his role ensured that his reputation would never recover. As the legal process concluded, the case gradually faded from headlines, though it remained etched in public memory. Documentaries and crime podcasts revisited the events, framing them as one of the most disturbing domestic cases of the decade. The combination of infidelity, familial betrayal, and lethal violence ensured its place in true crime archives. For the community, closure came slowly. While the verdict provided legal resolution, the moral questions lingered. Could betrayal of such magnitude ever be considered mitigating? Was the father more culpable morally, even if not legally? Could the tragedy have been prevented through earlier intervention? These debates persisted long after the courtroom lights dimmed. The conclusion of the case underscored the destructive power of secrecy and betrayal. At its core, the tragedy involved three individuals whose choices intertwined in catastrophic ways. A wife who entered a forbidden relationship, a father who violated fundamental boundaries, and a husband whose response turned violent. Each decision compounded the next, culminating in a death, a life sentence, and a family in ruins. The legal system responded as it was designed to, assessing evidence, weighing arguments, and delivering accountability. Yet the deeper wounds, those of trust, morality, and family bonds, remained beyond the reach of any verdict. The tragedy became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences when loyalty is broken and emotions left unchecked. Part 4 closed the case with finality. The jury's verdict established guilt, the sentencing ensured accountability, and the aftermath left scars that extended beyond the courtroom. The family was destroyed, the community shaken, and the public left to grapple with questions of betrayal, morality, and justice. The story ended not with resolution but with irrevocable loss. A woman dead, a man imprisoned for life, and a father condemned by public opinion. Together, their lives formed the narrative of one of America's most shocking domestic crimes, a tragedy that demonstrated how deeply personal betrayal can ignite consequences that reverberate far beyond the walls of a single home.